This is a presentation of Aaron Leicht Sports Media. This is the Game Reports.
Welcome in. I'm Aaron Leicht, and I would like to welcome a special guest today. With us is Dave Richard. He is the senior fantasy writer for CBS Sports. He's been doing this for over 20 years. He was actually the first NFL.com writer, moved over to CBS Sports 15 years ago, and he's been doing it ever since, helping you win your league. You can find him on their podcast, Fantasy Football Today. It's at cbssports.com and on CBS Sports HQ. Dave, thanks so much for joining us today.
Pleasure to be here, Aaron.
COVID didn't cancel any games necessarily last season, but it did take players out of games and people had to adjust. I can remember back specifically week 12, Denver didn't even have a quarterback. Fantasy owners, commissioners, they were forced to make adjustments before and during the season. What did we learn from that we could apply to this year when we're getting ready for the fantasy season?
Well, I think there's a couple of ways to go about this. The one is as a fantasy commissioner and the other one is a fantasy manager. If you're a fantasy commissioner and a fantasy manager, you may have enjoyed having IR spots on your bench. And not every league did that, Aaron. But what CBS did as a platform for all of its fantasy leagues was offer people the chance to put IR spots at the end of the bench. So they didn't count toward a bench spot, but that's where you could kind of stash players, and you could stash them if they were on the actual NFL IR or if they were on a COVID list and they were going to miss a game or two because of that. The fantasy managers learned that staying on top of the news is still among the most important things you can do to be successful in fantasy football. And there was a ton of news when Cam Newton went on the COVID list early in the year. It was on a Saturday morning when the news broke. So a good fantasy manager will have some sort of alert hit their phone. It could be the CBS Sports app because it's a pretty damn good app. And you see that alert and you know that there's something brewing in the NFL. Will it affect your fantasy team? Probably so. Make plans for it. Be alert and be aware of what's going on. And then take advantage of those IR spots as they become a thing. Fantasy managers have to know, okay, maybe when we draft this year, there's a player that gets hurt in training camp and they start the year on IR. And maybe it's one of those fringe guys, Aaron, that wouldn't normally get taken in every single draft, but maybe they would as a late round pick in a handful of drafts. And if they're on IR, they fall off the radar for a lot of people who play fantasy football. But a smart fantasy manager can draft a player like that who's going to start the year on IR, stash them on IR, and then hit the waiver wire even before week one to pick somebody else up. It's almost like you're expanding your roster and expanding your potential depth at any position to hopefully pay off even 3 weeks later for your fantasy squad.
What is the best way for people to research before draft day?
Well, I think that's a pretty open-ended question, Aaron. There are a lot of ways that the diamonds in the rough come out in fantasy football. And there's maybe one running back a year who comes out of the woodwork. I would say that James Robinson was that guy last year. And he wasn't really on anybody's radar until Leonard Fournette got cut by Jacksonville. And there's always a surprise cut every year too. But it really comes down to recognizing where there might be opportunity. And that goes across the board for any position. It can be that way for quarterback. It can be that way for tight end. Jonnu Smith was my favorite late round guy to draft last year because I thought he would have a better opportunity to showcase his athleticism in Tennessee. And it paid off through the first half of the year, maybe 2/3 of the year. He definitely did not end the season strong, but he started it strong and he helped people get off to a great start in fantasy. You can also look at it as an opportunity to just be better than they were last year. In the case of Aaron Rodgers, who I know you had on one of your championship teams, Aaron. Aaron Rodgers was overlooked and overvalued in a lot of fantasy drafts, or overlooked and undervalued, I should say. And he ended up being just dynamic.
What are your thoughts on the late round values at quarterback?
You're going to find somebody late in every fantasy draft that you'll be comfortable starting. And you might even find two guys. And I almost feel like there's a pretty consistent trend going on here where there's a quarterback who you draft late in fantasy and they turn out to be so good that they're the league MVP. Think about it. We just had Aaron Rodgers, who, I mean, maybe some people took him in round 6 or round 7, but In a lot of the leagues that I was in, Aaron, he was drafted in the double-digit rounds. People were definitely undervaluing him, not expecting him to do what he just did. The year before was Lamar Jackson, and people could see the upside in Lamar Jackson, but there was also a lot of downside in Lamar Jackson. He was a late-round pick who broke out. The year before that was Patrick Mahomes, and Mahomes was someone who we really had barely seen play. We knew what the upside could be. And I was pretty bullish on Patrick Mahomes, and he ended up being amazing. And he still is considered to be, all three of these quarterbacks are going to be very popular on draft day. But I think that there's two ways to attack the quarterback position. The one that you're asking about, as far as getting value, you're trying to find the guy who is going to just turn into the league MVP. And that's simplifying it. And it's almost like trying to find a winning Powerball ticket. Like, how do you do that? You have to be insanely lucky. This one is a little bit more about strategy and savvy, knowing what it takes to be a great fantasy quarterback. These days, you need a guy that can run for 500 yards. These days, you need a quarterback that can total 30 touchdowns, get well over 4,000 yards, and do it on a consistent basis. I'm not talking about 50 fantasy points one week and then 18 the next week, 19 after that, 22 after that, and then boom, 40 after that. You want to have somebody who's consistently playing at a high level, contending for the league MVP, contending for the fantasy MVP, and rushing has become a big part of the quarterback position. I think you're going to see somebody like Jalen Hurts, who's going to be presumably the starting quarterback for the Eagles, be a very popular pick as a top 12 guy who may not necessarily warrant it, but he's got the potential to do it because he runs so much, because he's on a team that might not necessarily be competitive. They might have to play from behind. He's got a propensity to throw deep sometimes. He's also got quite a propensity to run. It's important. Hurts will be one of those guys. And there will be a handful of other quarterbacks. Trevor Lawrence can end up being one of those guys. We know that he can run for touchdowns. He scored 17 touchdowns the past 2 seasons at Clemson. He could end up being somebody that fantasy managers look at late. Now, I don't think Lawrence is going to be the league MVP, and I'd be shocked if Jalen Hurts was the league MVP, but that's the type of quarterback that fantasy managers need to get their mind set to. Somebody who can do all these extra things that they can get with a late round pick, and that hopefully can turn into someone that they're starting on a weekly basis in their fantasy leagues.
There has been a shift, right? I mean, why would you say there is such a focus on the mobile quarterback right now?
Because they put up more fantasy points. That's the name of the game. I don't want to get a quarterback who looks good throwing a football. If I did that, then, Derek Carr might be my quarterback more often than not. He's got a nice compact release and it looks like a pro quarterback, but he doesn't necessarily get a ton of fantasy points game in and game out. You want a quarterback who will throw well and will run a lot, because you get a point for every 10 rushing yards and you get the full 6 points for every rushing touchdown. Some leagues you get the full 6 for a passing touchdown too. That's the way that we do it on CBS, because a touchdown is a touchdown. They shouldn't be devalued just because you're throwing one versus running one. Just a philosophical thing there. But the game is changing. The NFL is changing, and the coaches are adapting to what colleges are doing. And they're doing that so that the transition from the players from college to the pros is easier. And it flattens the learning curve, and it makes it easier for these quarterbacks to go out there and do what they're used to doing. That's what's going to make Trevor Lawrence such a good quarterback for Jacksonville, is that he's going to continue to run the type of offense that he's been running at Clemson, because it's not exactly a carbon copy of what Urban Meyer's been doing at Ohio State and at Florida, but there are a ton of similarities, and Lawrence is suited to do that, and he's got pinpoint accuracy to go along with it. So eventually Trevor Lawrence will be a league MVP and will be a fantasy MVP. I just don't see it happening in 2021, but that's just how things have been shaping in the NFL, where quarterbacks, like, that's part of the reason why it was such a surprise for Aaron Rodgers to have the year that he had, because he's not running for 500 yards over the course of the season. He's lucky if he gets 2 rushing touchdowns over the course of a season, but he just kept gunning to Devontae Adams. He made something out of Robert Tonyan. Occasionally, Marquez Valdez-Scantling or Alan Lazard would catch a touchdown and do great things for Aaron Rodgers. But Rodgers is having a phenomenal statistical year. Might end up being an outlier for him, might not be so great in 2021, but that was enough for him to ascend past a lot of those rushing quarterbacks. It doesn't mean that that's what you should look for on draft day. It's the rushing quarterbacks that can give you certainly a better edge over those pass-only type of quarterbacks.
even after big injuries last year. I mean, we saw, you know, two of the top running backs go down in Saquon Barkley and Christian McCaffrey almost immediately. That was heartbreaking for a lot of people trying to, you know, recover from that. Looking at even mock drafts already, it seems like running backs are still dominating, at least say the first 7 picks typically of the first round for 2021. How do you plan to address that position this year?
It's been this way for the last. I've been analyzing fantasy for almost 20 years, Aaron. It's a real job. This is a real thing that I've been doing. And running backs dominating round 1 has been as consistent as me breathing air over that time. And it's going to continue to be that way. In fact, I think in a non-PPR league, I wouldn't be surprised if the entire first round were running backs, because there are so many that are good and have a chance to be for 1,500 total yards. Sure. Maybe even a few that can get you to 2,000 total yards, which you see maybe one guy do every other year or something like that. Maybe it's rarer than that. It probably is. But the way the running backs are being utilized these days, 2,000 total yards, it's more of a reality than it's ever been before. Bottom line is that there are a lot of talented running backs. And just because a guy got hurt last year doesn't mean that they're straight up trash the following year. McCaffrey, it almost seemed like bad luck. He had the high ankle sprain, then he hurt his shoulder. Saquon, torn ACL, that stuff stinks, but he's got the talent and certainly the wherewithal to come back and play at a strong level after having the injury and the recovery from that. And I just think the position is going to be popular. We can talk about quarterbacks some more and how there's going to be great values in the later rounds. Wide receiver is deep as ever. Tight end is still basically the same. There will be kind of a draw to taking the elite level tight ends, the Kelseys, the Wallers, and the Kittles. But I think that the pressure that fantasy drafters will have in 2021 will be on getting running backs and shoring up that position first and foremost with at least one guy before going to attack the other positions on draft day. I don't see it changing. I don't think that there are enough unique wide receivers to challenge any of the unique running backs at the top of the draft board.
This happens, I think, to some fantasy managers every single year. I see it. You know, you'll be drafting with a group of guys and you'll kind of see the look of contempt on their face. You know, they're half an hour into the draft, right? Mistakes have been made. They don't like their early draft picks. What can they do to recover as they get towards those middle rounds?
Drink heavily. Start a new league. Find a time machine. Look, the people that you're describing, Aaron, are the people who aren't prepared. That's been my experience. I've got a buddy who I've been playing in a fantasy league with for over a decade. And of course, I'm researching all year long, and there's a bunch of people in the league who research all year long. This is literally that guy who swings by the grocery store on his way to the draft, finds a magazine that looks cool, picks up the magazine, takes it with him into the draft, and he starts picking off of what the magazine recommends. He's got no idea what's happened since that magazine published, which was probably in June, maybe early July if he's lucky. And we're drafting in late August after the 3rd week of the preseason when there's a ton of news that's reshaped every roster in the NFL. If you're unprepared, you might as well hope that you get a wild card berth in your fantasy league. You got to know what you're doing. And if you know what you're doing, you'll never have that look of contempt on your face. Even if guys that you really like say you got to have Alvin Kamara in your fantasy draft, but you're picking 5th and he goes right in front of you at 4, you're going to know to go in a different direction, whether it's Nick Chubb or Austin Eckler or whoever you pick. James Robinson maybe is going to be on your list. You will know what the plan B is at every turn in the draft so that you're not stuck there staring at a list of players going, who the hell am I going to take now? Because there's no one left that's good. And usually it's those smart drafters when they're at that point where they really look at the running back position, the best name is Carlos Hyde, and the best receiver left is Larry Fitzgerald, and the best tight end left is, Frank Wycheck, just so we don't disparage anybody else here while I'm naming names. That's when they pivot to a quarterback because it's safe. It's a guy that they know can put up fantasy points. It's a good value in the draft. And then they can just punt till the next round to go pick up a different player in a different position that they'll hopefully feel better about. Preparation is very key when it comes to draft day. And anybody who's not prepared, let's put it this way, Aaron. If you were going to start a fantasy league a high stakes league, you would want to find 11 other people who wouldn't prepare for it at all, so that you, and I know you prepare for your fantasy drafts, you would be ready to take their money, take the trophy, win the league, be a stud.
You've given us so much great advice today. What is one golden Dave Richard best practice that people can take to draft day for a winning roster in 2021?
Know your rules before you draft. There are people, this happens in our expert drafts. So again, the same type of leagues I'm talking about with people from all over the internet. Hey, is this a PPR league or not? They're asking in round 4. Okay. Ask that question when you sign up to join the draft. Ask to see the rules. Find out if it's, what's the transaction policy? Can you do ad drops whenever you want? Is there a night of the week where you can do waivers? Can you do waivers every night of the week? Is it a free agent acquisition budget, a FAB, where you can go and bid on players to get them on your team? Know what the rules of the league are before you get into it, so that you can prepare accordingly for the draft. And I'm not talking about, locking yourself in a hotel room for a weekend and reading and studying everything that you need to know about the league, but an hour a weekend leading up to the draft, just getting a list of names of here are some guys that are breakout candidates, and here's why, and maybe you agree with them. Okay, put a star next to their name in your rankings that you take into the draft. Do some sort of preparation to go in, and part of that preparation is knowing what type of a league that you're in, what the rules are, how many quarterbacks can you start, how many receivers do you need to start, and you're ahead of everybody else that's not thinking like that. Those other people that are unprepared, they're thinking about totally unimportant stuff like, paying their mortgage or taking their spouse to dinner or whatever. You're thinking about fantasy football, which is the most important thing on the planet. And that's how it should be.
Stay focused, right? Don't be that guy.
Don't be that guy, and know exactly what you're getting into in your drafts.
Perfect. Dave, thank you so much for being with us today. I appreciate you taking the time so much.
An honor to be with you, Aaron.
You've been listening to Dave Richard. You can find him at Twitter at Dave Richard, #AskFFT, because you can also find him on Fantasy Football Today, the podcast. You can subscribe at cbssports.com, and you can find it live streaming at CBS Sports HQ. I'm Aaron Leicht. Thanks so much for watching.
This has been a presentation of Aaron Leicht Sports Media.